Mary sat across from me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. But beneath it, I could see something else, uncertainty, maybe even a silent plea for reassurance. "Doc, is it even possible to be close to someone who sees the world completely differently?" I smiled, tilting my head slightly. "Why wouldn't it be?" She exhaled, her fingers drumming against her elbow. "John and I, we're so different. He's always talking about change, about fighting for social justice. And me? I believe in tradition, in family values. It used to be just an interesting contrast between us. But now, every conversation feels like a battlefield." I leaned forward slightly. "Do these arguments stop you from wanting to be with him?" She hesitated. "Not exactly. We still respect each other. But sometimes I wonder if we even belong in the same world. I mean, how can you build something lasting when you don't even see life through the same lens?" I let the question settle between us. This kind of conflict wasn't uncommon, especially now, when ideological divides felt sharper than ever. "Has something changed recently?" A shadow flickered across her face, her defensive posture softening just a bit. "Yeah, something did." She took a deep breath. "The other day, after another one of our debates, John noticed the neighbor's kid, Tommy, sitting on his front porch, looking completely miserable. He found out Tommy's family couldn't afford a Thanksgiving dinner this year. And you know what John did? He decided to organize a community fundraiser. He didn't just talk about it, he started calling people, setting up a whole event." I noticed the way her voice changed as she spoke about it. There was warmth now, an unspoken admiration. "You joined him?" A small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of her lips. At first, I resisted. I thought, maybe this was just another one of his ways to push his views on me. But then I realized something. It wasn't about politics or ideology. It was about a kid who just wanted to have a meal like everyone else. And that mattered more than our arguments. I nodded. "So you decided to help?" She let out a quiet laugh. "I did. And, something weird happened. We worked together for days, argued, disagreed on how things should be done, but we made it work. The event turned out amazing. We raised enough money not just for Tommy's family, but for a dozen others. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I saw John differently. Not as the guy, on the other side, of some endless debate. Just as someone who cares. There it was. The moment of realization, the shift in perspective that often changed everything. "And what does that mean for you now?" Mary was quiet for a moment, her fingers relaxing on her arms. "I don't know yet. But I think I was so focused on what made us different, I forgot to see what made us work. Maybe our views will never align perfectly. But maybe that's not the point." I smiled. "Maybe not. Maybe the point is finding what unites you, rather than what divides you." She met my gaze, a new kind of understanding in her eyes. "Yeah. Maybe it is." Mary sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly as if trying to release the weight of unspoken thoughts. For a moment, she seemed lost in them, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the seam of her sleeve. "It's strange. Even after the fundraiser, even after seeing John in this new light, our arguments didn't stop. If anything, they got more intense." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "It's like I started noticing it more. The way we approach things. He always wants change, wants to push boundaries, make noise. I've never been that way. I like stability, I like knowing what to expect. And the more I saw how deep our differences ran, the more I wondered, is respect enough? Can two people really make it work when they see the world so differently?" She shook her head, almost frustrated with herself. "There was this one night, just last week. We were supposed to have a quiet dinner, just the two of us. And, of course, somehow the conversation turned political. It always does. I don't even remember how it started, but suddenly we were going back and forth, voices rising. Not yelling, not fighting. Just, standing our ground. I said something about how traditions hold society together, and he just looked at me, like he didn't recognize me for a second. She hesitated, as if reliving the moment. He said, "Mary, do you ever wonder if the world you're holding onto so tightly isn't as perfect as you think?" Her fingers curled into her palms. And I got defensive. Of course, I did. I told him that change for the sake of change isn't always good. That some things are worth preserving. That not everything needs to be torn apart and rebuilt just because someone thinks they can do it better. And you know what he did? He just sat there, silent. And that made me angrier than if he'd argued back. Her voice softened. When he finally spoke, he just said, "I don't want to fight with you, Mary. I just want to understand why you're so afraid of the world changing." She looked up at me, something vulnerable in her expression. That's what got me. Not the argument, not the disagreement. That question. Because I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I didn't want to admit what it was. I let the silence stretch between us, giving her space. Maybe I am afraid. Maybe I don't want things to change because what if the world moves on and I don't recognize it anymore? What if I don't fit in it? Her voice was quieter now. And what if one day, John looks at me and realizes I'm part of the world he wants to change? The air in the room felt heavier now, filled with the weight of her honesty. "Have you asked him that?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "No. I wouldn't even know how." I leaned forward slightly. "Maybe the real question isn't whether your differences will pull you apart. Maybe it's whether you're both willing to keep asking the hard questions, even when they make you uncomfortable." She pressed her lips together, thinking. I guess I never thought of it that way. For the first time since she walked in, she didn't look frustrated or lost. Just, thoughtful. And that was something. Mary shifted in her seat, her fingers playing absent-mindedly with the edge of her sleeve. After that night, things felt fragile. Not broken, but like we were standing on opposite ends of a bridge, unsure whether to take a step forward or just turn around. She exhaled slowly, as if trying to organize her thoughts. And then, the thing with Tommy happened. Or, I guess, John made it happen. Her voice softened. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another one of John's ideas, another way to fix something, to prove his point. But when I saw him watching Tommy that day, I knew it was different. He wasn't thinking about politics or grand statements. He just saw a kid who was hurting. Her gaze flickered to mine. That's what made me say yes. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. I won't lie, I was hesitant. The whole thing felt messy. Calling people, asking for donations, planning an event on short notice. It's not the kind of thing I usually do. But John was so certain. Like he knew it would work, like it had to. She smiled, just a little. And maybe that certainty was contagious, because before I knew it, I was knee-deep in it too. We spent hours together, on the phone, knocking on doors, setting up tables. And we were still us, still different. He wanted to make speeches, I wanted to keep things simple. He wanted to get the whole community involved, I wanted to focus on just helping Tommy's family. We argued, we pushed back against each other. But somewhere in all of it, something shifted. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to find the right words. I stopped seeing John as someone trying to prove a point. And I think he stopped seeing me as someone afraid of change. We were just two people trying to do something good. She let out a quiet laugh. It's funny, there was this moment, right in the middle of setting up. We were stringing lights around the tables, and I was struggling with this tangled mess of wires. John walked over, took them from my hands, and said, "Here, let me." She paused, a small, thoughtful smile playing on her lips. I know it sounds stupid, but it stuck with me. Because for all our differences, that's who he is. He sees a problem, and his instinct is to fix it. And for once, I didn't argue. I just let him. She glanced down at her hands, then back up at me. The night of the fundraiser, when people started arriving, I looked around and realized, this wasn't just John's idea anymore. It was ours. We made it happen together. She sat back, exhaling slowly. And in that moment, it didn't matter that we saw the world differently. It just mattered that we did something that made it better. For a while, she was quiet, lost in thought. I think that's the first time I really understood him. I let her words settle before speaking. Sometimes, understanding doesn't come from agreeing. It comes from doing. She nodded, a faraway look in her eyes. Yeah. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what that meant. Mary leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. The fundraiser was a success. More than I expected, honestly. People came together in ways I didn't think possible. Families who had never spoken to each other before sat at the same tables, sharing food, laughing, telling stories. And Tommy, the look on his face when he saw the feast laid out for him and his family. I don't think I'll ever forget that. She smiled, but there was something else beneath it, something softer, more personal. John was in his element. Moving from table to table, making sure everyone had what they needed, thanking volunteers, giving one of his usual passionate speeches. And me? I just watched. Not because I felt out of place, but because I realized something in that moment. She looked down at her hands, then back up at me. I was proud of him. Not just for what he did, but for who he was. For the way he cared. For the way he threw himself into things, heart first, no hesitation. I always saw it as recklessness before, as this need to shake things up just for the sake of it. But standing there, watching him with those people, I knew better. She let out a quiet breath. But the real moment, the one that really stuck with me, came later that night. After everyone had gone home, after we'd packed up the last of the tables and chairs. It was just the two of us, sitting on the curb, exhausted. I was sore, my feet were killing me, but I felt good. Like I'd done something that mattered. She glanced at me, her voice softer now. And then John turned to me and said, "You know, Mary, I don't think I've ever seen you smile like that before." A small, almost embarrassed laugh escaped her lips. I didn't know what to say. Because I hadn't even realized I was smiling. And then he said, "You should do this more often." She shook her head, her gaze distant. At first, I thought he meant the fundraiser. But that wasn't it. He meant stepping outside of my comfort zone. Letting go of my fear of things changing. Being part of something, not just watching from the sidelines. She was quiet for a moment, as if letting the words settle. I wanted to argue with him. Tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't afraid of change, that I was just careful, that I valued stability, tradition. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Her fingers traced the edge of her sleeve, a small habit I'd noticed when she was deep in thought. For so long, I thought John and I were too different. That eventually, one of us would have to compromise too much, or we'd just drift apart. But maybe it was never about one of us changing. Maybe it was about learning from each other, pushing each other in ways we wouldn't push ourselves. She looked at me then, her expression more certain than before. I still don't know if we'll ever see the world the same way. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't have to. A small smile crossed her lips. Maybe what matters is that we keep building something together, even if we don't always agree on how. I let her words linger in the air before responding. Some of the strongest relationships aren't built on perfect agreement, but on a willingness to grow together. She nodded, as if the thought was finally settling in. Yeah. And for the first time, I think I actually believe that. Mary sat in silence for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, fingers loosely intertwined. There was something different in her posture, less tension, more ease, as if the weight she had carried into this room was finally beginning to lift. I've been thinking a lot about what you said last time. About how relationships aren't about perfect agreement but about growing together. It stuck with me. She glanced down, then back up, a quiet determination in her eyes. The night after the fundraiser, John and I sat on the couch, just talking. No debates, no trying to prove a point. Just talking. And at one point, I asked him, "Do you ever feel like we're too different?" She let out a small breath, as if she could still hear the pause that followed. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Every day." Her lips curved into a wry smile. I don't know what I expected him to say. Maybe something reassuring, like, "No, of course not," or, "We're not that different." But he was honest. He admitted it. And instead of scaring me, it actually made me feel better. She tilted her head slightly, considering. Because then he said, "But I also think that's what makes us work." Her fingers brushed absently against her sleeve. I asked him what he meant, and he said, "If we thought the same way, wanted the same things, had the same opinions, we'd never challenge each other." You make me think, Mary. Even when I don't want to. Even when it frustrates the hell out of me. A soft laugh escaped her lips. And then he said, "I don't want a version of you that agrees with me. I want you, even when you drive me crazy." She shook her head, as if still trying to wrap her mind around it. For so long, I thought one of us would have to change too much, or that eventually, our differences would tear us apart. But maybe love isn't about finding someone who sees the world exactly like you do. Maybe it's about finding someone who makes you see more of it. She looked up at me, her expression lighter than before. I think I was so scared of losing myself that I didn't realize, John never wanted me to change. He just wanted me to show up. To be fully in this, instead of always hesitating, always worrying about what comes next. She exhaled, a deep, steadying breath. So I told him, "I don't want a version of you that agrees with me either." And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just saying it to convince myself. I actually meant it. Her gaze held something steady, something certain. I don't know where we'll end up. Maybe we'll keep challenging each other until it wears us out. Or maybe we'll keep building something that lasts, brick by brick, through every argument, every difference, every moment where we choose each other anyway. She gave a small, thoughtful shrug. But for now, I'm not afraid of the question anymore. I studied her for a moment, then nodded. Not having all the answers doesn't mean you're lost. It just means you're still moving forward. She smiled, and this time, it reached her eyes. Yeah. And for once, I think that's enough. Have you ever been in a relationship where your differences felt like a challenge? Did they push you apart or bring you closer? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts.